the first panel. And our first participant is Dr. Taylor Bennett. He's an assistant professor of semiotics, and he will present us Kristeva as a semiotician today.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organization. Thank you to Bulgarian University. It's lovely to be back. Last time I was here was in 2017 for the 2014 for the World Congress of Semiotics, which was also fantastic, except for that now the metro actually reaches this location. At the time, coming from the center to the site of the conference was difficult. So, yes, I work as an assistant professor at Tarasti University in Olomouc, which is in Czech Republic, in the Department of General Linguistics. And we're in the process of trying to establish a new center for general semiotics. And, well, for this reason, among others, I am deeply invested still in the language and vocabulary of the sign, yes, the 20th century sign, and in structural linguistics. So my presentation will probably not be as futuristic as the last one, which was excellent. Nevertheless, I remain indebted to this vocabulary. Okay. No, this is fine. But so we're establishing, as I said, a general center for general semiotics. And well, for this reason, I've been preoccupied with the issue of what is the position of structural semiology and deconstruction, and what is the position of Kristeva? And well, in my view, the importance of Kristeva for general semiotics is indisputable. But nevertheless, even the mention of her name meets with considerable resistance and rejection in the International Semiotic Society. And I can say this with some authority on the matter, having presented at over 30 international conferences in 12 countries in my time as a doctoral student and now as an assistant professor. So, I mean, from one side, one can describe post-structuralism and semiotics as a kind of oppressive force that needs to be done away with. On the other hand, one can also note a certain, well, very strong antipathy towards post-structuralism. I include Kristeva here, an antipathy towards structural linguistics. And so I find myself on the other side actually trying to, well, fight that antipathy and to recuperate this, what I see to be somewhat neglected area, which includes structural linguistics, deconstruction, and psychoanalysis. And this is all in the aim of trying to foster this new Center for General Semiotics and to consolidate a curriculum around certain figures. And for me, Kristeva is the figure for a number of reasons. And so in the process, I want to confront some of this, well, sources of disavowal and rejection, some of which are purely lies and slander and purely personal ad hominem attacks against Kristeva, and others of which are actually more legitimate theoretical disagreements. And I'll start with the theoretical disagreements, and only at the end I'll come back to these lies and slander, which are more easily rejected. So one of the reasons, when it comes to the theoretical disagreements with Kristeva, one of the common charges against her is that she cleaves too closely to the theoretical coordinates of structural linguistics, and that this is outdated, that she borrows only from linguistics in order to inform the semiotic analysis. And so Kristeva is only interested in language. I guess this is a common criticism that you hear, particularly from the international semiotic community, because in semiotics today, the main interest has shifted decisively away from linguistics and literature towards, well, emotion, affect, and drive, embodiment, and also towards animal studies, non-human communication in post-humanism and so on. And so for them, to borrow strictly from linguistics or to assert that linguistics is the primary source of theoretic coordinates for semiotics is a kind of blasphemy or old-fashioned approach. With a number of, well, normative implications also. So to assert linguistics as the sort of theoretic core of semiotics is also anthropocentric, like Kristeva doesn't love animals enough or whatever. This is common position. So there's an attributed normativity to the linguistic emphasis. And, as we know, Kristeva was deeply committed to sense, affect, sensory motor, emotion, drives, instincts, and so on. It's only that she cleaves to a certain formalism where she said, yes, sense, affect, sensory affect, emotion, and drive exist, but we can only track them in terms of the disruptions and inconsistencies which they produce in language. Right? So this is a kind of qualification that she always adds, or consistently adds at least, to her interest in the chora and the drives, but nevertheless was committed to. It was the very idea, the whole purpose of remaining fixated on the way that language controls, or the symbolic controls and dictates our thought and actions, was indeed to uncover the affect and drive. But nevertheless, this qualification that she adds is deeply unsatisfying to, well, semioticians today, who are committed to a more direct descriptive apparatus, or at least they think more direct descriptive apparatus for the unconscious, or for emotion and drive, or for non-human meaning. Yes. So, but in my dissertation, I dedicate some time. Some time to, my slides are moving, but
I think we have a problem with.
Yeah, my dissertation, which I defended and published in 2021, quite recently, I dedicate some time to dispelling this false notion of logocentrism. The claim, okay, it's working now, thank you. So the claim from some circles that Kristeva is only interested in language, that some are calling logocentrism. And so I dedicate a considerable amount of time in my dissertation to dispelling what I find to be a very naive notion of what logocentrism means. Indeed, Kristeva privileges the modality of language above all others for tracking signs. But this, just privileging the modality of language is not the same as logocentrism, as we know. Logocentrism is quite a bit more complicated, and, well, crucially, logocentrism may happen in any modality. Logocentrism doesn't only happen in verbal language, et cetera, et cetera. I'll just briefly read a quote from my introduction. So the common claim today is that semiology is logocentric, and popular semiotics has pivoted to avoid the stigma of logocentrism, but this is a mistake in several important ways. Logocentrism is wrongly conceived as the claim that meaning is always a function of verbal language. Logocentrism is rather the belief that the signified has a natural bond with the referent, and that while different signifiers are used in different languages, the signifieds to which these signifiers are correlated are the same for everyone across all cultures. So logocentrism is not an effect of language strictly, but it's a problem for every modality. And it is difficult to conceive a critique of logocentrism that does not employ verbal language as its primary medium. Thus, no matter our interest in non-linguistic meaning, our primary target has to remain language, because language, no matter the topic of our discussion, always remains the intermediary for the discussion. This was Kristeva's main point. And it does consist in a kind of formalism, linguistic formalism, and a resistance to assuming that we can actually exhaustively describe non-linguistic meaning, or even it's like index non-linguistic meaning in any kind of direct way. So Kristeva's emphasis upon language is not at the expense of sensory, motor, affect, and drive, but on the contrary, her emphasis upon language is for the very purpose of recovering that unconscious meaning. I think, as we know, this is basics. This is Kristeva basics. And so it's in my introduction and first chapter, which is dedicated to what I call second generation semiology, which is particularly Barthes, Lacan, Kristeva, and Louis Hjelmslev. I guess Hjelmslev's the main figure here. also Benveniste and some others. So it's in this chapter where I discuss logocentrism particularly, and I rebut the claim that the structural semiology is logocentric. And then later I do propose there may be some synthesis, that as long as we understand the methods of second generation semiology properly, they too can be valuable and applicable to the study of non-human meaning, affect and drive, sensory motor, et cetera, and thus applicable also to the domain of study, which is dominated actually now by the semiotics of Charles Peirce, in which we get this language of icon index symbol, which is useful in itself, but which actually falls prey to this logocentrism much more consistently. That is, they confuse the signified with the referent much more consistently in the form of the object. Peirce can be read non-logocentrically, but anyway, it's this domain where we get this error most commonly. And this is where I attempt at least to propose some synthesis. So it's not despite of our interest in non-linguistic meaning that we cleave to the theoretic coordinates of structural linguistics, but because of that we retain linguistics at the core. But this does require some additional qualifications as to what we mean by linguistics. We all, of course, recall Ferdinand de Saussure's statement that linguistics is only one small part of the larger semiology. Semiology, which includes many different modalities of the expression of the sign. We all recall this and we know that he meant it. But there are risks that come along with, and when I talk about the formalism of Kristeva, in a way, what this formalism means is that while we acknowledge that signifier and signified may be correlated on any modality, nevertheless, the discussion of that correlation must always take place through language, and thus, despite the fact that semiology covers a broad range of signs, nevertheless, the level of our analysis takes place at language. And this is why, for example, Roland Barthes took Saussure's initial claim and recognized its dangers. He recognized already in 67 when writing Elements of Semiology that this claim from Saussure was going to be taken in the wrong way, and that if we begin to import the vocabularies and terminology from a wide variety of other fields, that the task of semiology was going to become too broad, and that semiotics would eventually become somewhat watered down by borrowing from many different fields and terminologies, which has come to be the case. And this is why Barthes actually reverses Saussure's classic claim, and says, because he recognized the danger of semiotics becoming watered down if it diverged too far from linguistics, he wrote that we must now face the possibility of inverting Saussure's declaration. Linguistics is not a part of the general science of signs, even the privileged part. It is semiology, which is a part of linguistics. So this provocative polemic reversal of Barthes has, brought no shortage of vitriol down upon his head, and the same kind of vitriol which has been brought down upon Kristeva's head, I guess, not only because of her interest in linguistics, but in Barthes' case, it is indeed his expressed interest in prioritization of linguistics, which has brought this contemporary rejection. But he concedes, while linguistics must remain the principal theoretic core of semiotics, even so, such language is not quite that of the linguist, or that it is what he means by linguistics is something a little different. In fact, he's already gesturing towards what we call in the department where I work, general linguistics, or what Benveniste called, as I'm going to explain a little later, this translinguistics, which turns out to be something a bit different. That is, it's not a special linguistics. It's certainly not a linguistics that's restricted to the study of any specific language, or even a linguistics that's restricted to Indo-European languages, but may come to include the non-alphabetic languages such as Chinese. And that this inclusion is the decisive change that is made in what this in second generation semiology. And this is actually something which unites most of the thinkers which I listed earlier, including Derrida. I would mention here that it actually Derrida, who stressed most decisively that even such radically different languages as Chinese must be included in order that general linguistics be applicable to all modalities of the sign, specifically because of its non-alphabetic character. And I might even call into question, I almost wanted to raise my hand in this claim about Derrida being one of these people who takes the inside and the outside somehow naively, that he didn't question the boundary between the inside and the outside, but it's going to be discussed later. Anyway, Derrida insists that linguistics, our linguistics that we're talking about, is not general as long as it defines its outside and inside in terms of determined linguistic models. By determined linguistic models here, he means alphabetic models. And this is a very complex issue, the issue of phono-logocentrism, which I will not get into today. But it is Derrida who deals with it, well, most decisively. And interestingly here, also Benveniste stresses the fact that his general linguistics in his book, Problems of General Linguistics, must include non-alphabetic languages, particularly Chinese, in order to be general enough to accommodate the real semiology. And so this is why he poses the question, provocative question. What is both the integral and concrete object of general linguistics? Because the answer is not obvious. I raised Benveniste here also because in Kristeva's latest collection of essays, she has an essay dedicated to Benveniste, which is very moving, and in which she deals with this problem of the problems of general linguistics and the breadth of general linguistics and what it really means to use linguistics as the core coordinate, the source for the core coordinates of semiology. And I also, well, I would emphasize also this dualism between the integral and the concrete object. It's a single object, but it dualistically described from in terms of a functional dualism. And I'm gonna, in the next slide, I wanna raise the issue of these functional dualisms. How does Benveniste's functional dualism of the semiotic and the semantic relate to Kristeva's dualism of the symbolic and the semiotic and some other dualisms, with consideration of the essay about Benveniste? Because actually it is this complexification which results from the functional dualisms that is another source of the disavowal of Kristeva. It's really just that it's really difficult material, and this arises from certain functional dualisms which remain unclarified, I guess. And as a semiotician trying to develop a new Center for General Semiotics, I've chosen that one of my tasks is to clarify these functional dualisms in comparison with the functional dualisms offered by other figures like Eco or Hjelmslev, in order to try to clarify. Because I think when the ideas of Kristeva are clarified sufficiently, the resistance falls away commonly, or at least if someone is doing the resisting, you come to learn that this resistance is motivated, well, it has ulterior motivations, whether political or otherwise. But normally it's because it's just too complicated and it arouses, well, perhaps an inferiority complex or whatever. But this is the book, Passions of Our Time. I haven't read the whole thing. I read the first essay about Barthes and the second one about Benveniste, and then some of the later ones. It's fabulous. And it's also, I mean, it has this feature, this characteristic of like forbidding complexity, which a lot of Kristeva's work does, which is one of my favorite features of Kristeva's work. And so this she raises the dualism of Benveniste in terms of what she calls the section from which this passage is taken from the essay about Benveniste is called the double signifyingness. The essay is called A Linguist Who Neither, Emile Benveniste, A Linguist Who Neither Says Nor Hides But Signifies, which details also Kristeva's personal relationship with Benveniste and the circumstances of his death at the time, which at the time he was actually the president of the International Association of Semiotics and of the International Society for Semiotic Studies. And it's disputable what might have happened if Bonveniste hadn't died at that time. Perhaps the leadership would have changed, or perhaps Kristeva would not have been expelled more or less from the Society of Semiotics, or would not have been motivated to leave, because she more or less left voluntarily, but nevertheless vanished from semiotics. Anyway, so the functional dualism that Bonveniste introduces here is it complements a number of other dualisms, including Kristeva's. But I will read a very brief quote from Kristeva about Bonveniste. The semiotic is a closed, for Bonveniste, the semiotic is a closed, generic, binary, intralinguistic, systematizing, and institutional meaning, which is defined by a paradigmatic and substitution relation. The semantic, on the other hand, is expressed in the sentence that articulates the signified of the sign or the intentional content. It is defined by a relation of connection or syntagm, where the sign, semiotic, becomes word or by the activity of the speaker. So my point, my first point here is just to say that this is the opposite of Kristeva's. Or I mean, we would say what Bonveniste says means here by the semiotic is what Kristeva means by the symbolic, and what he means by the semantic is what Kristeva means by the semiotic, right? Or at least that's the close approximation, it seems. Because the second term, the semantic, which has to do with the embodiment and includes process and maybe even the notion of the external, as problematic as that term is. So, and we have, so down here, I list a few more of the functional oppositions from the other sources. So I mentioned Bonveniste and Kristeva, but Eco, from Eco, you might call the same opposition signification and communication. And from Hjelmslav, we might call it the sign function and sign production. Sign production emphasizes particularly process and has to do with the typological mapping of objects as kinds of signs. So it includes context specificity and sender-receiver relations. And these features may not apply to each of them equally, but I think, so they all kind of match somewhat unevenly there. And they are in application to somewhat different domains, like Eco's signification and communication is like more of a methodological division. So in my dissertation, I also tried to systematize this, and you can see here's this like central diagram in my dissertation. At the inside, we have what Kristeva calls the symbolic, really, which is about concrete, well, it's about signified relations in abstraction, out of context, with no sender receiver relations. And on the outside is about process, and can include typologies of the sign, like Peirce's typology, icon, index, symbol, for example, which are used to like label, as if to label external objects and require the consideration of sender-receiver relations and context. Yes. And so, but I will just point, I'm running short on time, but I will point out that when Kristeva labels the second term, the semiotic, what she's doing is she's saying that this chora or this pre-linguistic domain is also a domain, as if a domain of signification, or at least that proper signification proper is not a matter either of purely the symbolic, that is the abstract center, or the semiotic, which is this periphery or perimeter, but their intersection, I guess. The goal is to track the existence and motility of the chora from in terms of the disruptions and inconsistencies it produces within the text, that is at the formal level. And so this is what I'm trying to show in my dissertation with my diagram, is just how it is we can talk about the impingement of the external upon the internal, relatively speaking. And I call this impingement retroactivity, coincidentally or interestingly. I'm borrowing that term from Greimas and Hjelmslav. I would be interested to know, well, where else this term retroactivity comes from, if anyone has an idea about that. So anyway, just this level of complexity introduces within the text of Kristeva a forbidding complexity. And this forbiddingness or foreboding or intimidation in terms of the text is reflected in all of her themes, and the pain and difficulty and challenge of Kristeva is my favorite feature of her work. Some might argue that we need to simplify or water down Kristeva. I say, on the contrary, not only should we emphasize its complexity, but we should also emphasize the dark, forbidding tone of the themes which show up everywhere in Kristeva. And this is why I choose to always emphasize one particular quote from Revolution in Poetic Language that captures this forbidding tone very well. And I will read it. She writes, this is a warning, basically, regarding the fact that semanalysis or semiotic or let's say second generation semiology is not for everyone. And we shouldn't approach it as though it should be. And this is her way of saying that going through the experience of this crucible exposes the subject to impossible dangers, relinquishing her identity in rhythm, dissolving the buffer of reality in a mobile discontinuity, leaving the shelter of the family, the state, or religion. The commotion the practice creates spares nothing. It destroys all constancy to produce another, and then destroys that one as well. So in confronting the sort of problematic reception of Kristeva in today's semiotics, we should not be surprised. And it would be a mistake to think that it was meant for everyone. The rejection of Kristeva goes with the territory. And so I come to my last slide, and I will conclude to remind that. So making these clarifications is a high priority to me because I feel some responsibility in starting this new Center for General Semiotics, where I want to make Kristeva one of the main figures, if not the main figure, alongside Jakobson and some of the other figures from Czech structuralism, the Prague Circle, as well as Louis Hjelmslev, among others, anyway. And also because the International Semiotics Institute is being relocated to Palacký University as well. It was formerly in Kaunas. This adds additional responsibility, I think. And we can say, so there are many other reasons and, well, stigmas attached to Kristeva, which have nothing to do with this complexity, but perhaps are motivated by the sense of inferiority or whatever other reason that people have. And people will latch on to just about anything in order to disavow her. Yes. For example, I mean, we could say three principal stigmas: fashionable nonsense, identity politics, or the claim that she was a Soviet agent. Regarding the issue of fashionable nonsense, I think that this is just ginned up and is a pure response to the fact that people don't get it. It's too complicated. Regarding identity politics, well, the very notion of identity politics and cultural Marxism was definitely something that was ginned up by an American think tank, conservative American think tank, to try to get Donald Trump elected, mostly. We can also ignore this. The last one, regarding the fact of her being, regarding the claim of her being a Soviet agent, we also know that this is pure nonsense and lies, and we can reject it out of hand. But there's also a book which actually satirizes this idea, and I'm not sure if it's tongue-in-cheek or not, but it's called The Seventh Function of Language. Interesting read. But finally, so there were some decisive figures in her expulsion from the International Association, such as, for example, Thomas Sebeok. We know he was funded by the CIA, for example, and he was involved in counterintelligence operations in Europe, as many others were, to try to eliminate the trace of Marxism from European intellect. So to whatever extent I can speak as a representative of the International Semiotics Society, I would just say that the time has come to displace some false idols and to replace them with more deserving people. And I would say Kristeva is probably the one. But thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr.